Every specialist in South Korea had already signed the papers. The man known as the Iron Dragon, a titan who ruled the streets with a fist of marble and ink, was now just a collection of fading heat and flat lines. With only 48 hours left before his own lieutenants pulled the plug to carve up his empire, the Vultures forgot one thing. A dragon never truly dies until his heart has no reason to beat. But in the silence of room 6002, a woman from his past was about to whisper a secret that would defy medical science. If you believe the truth can wake even the coldest soul, hit the like button, subscribe for more miracles, and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late. The neurosurgeons at the VIP wing of Seoul Central had given up on Park Joon-young after a brutal back-alley betrayal left the underworld's most feared boss with a shattered skull and zero brain activity. The Iron Dragon was nothing more than a body in a black hospital gown, exactly 2 days away from being erased forever. While his treacherous inner circle plotted in the hallways, counting the minutes until they could seize his shipping lanes and blood-stained fortune, a woman named Zandi Imani bypassed the guards. Zandi, the ex-wife he had cruelly cast aside years ago to protect her from his violent world, didn't enter that room looking for an inheritance. She entered as a woman drowning in a grief the world couldn't see. For 3 weeks, the machines insisted Joon-young's mind was a silent city where the lights had been turned off for good. But as Zandi collapsed onto his motionless chest, her bloodshot eyes mirroring the red flicker of the flatline monitor, she whispered a truth he was never meant to know. She was carrying the heir to his throne, the only piece of his humanity he hadn't managed to destroy. Little did the doctors know, that single whisper was a spark in a dark room, preparing to wake a predator who was finished with being a ghost. The air in the VIP wing of Seoul Central was thick with the scent of high-end cologne and antiseptic, a sterile battlefield where a kingdom was being dismantled in hushed, jagged whispers. Inside room 6002, Park Joon-young lay like a fallen monolith. The Iron Dragon, once a man whose shadow alone could freeze the docks of Incheon, was now a map of unmoving muscle and intricate ink, draped in the indignity of a hospital gown. The rhythmic, hollow hiss of the ventilator was the only pulse left in a room that had once vibrated with his presence. To the monitors, he was a flat line. To the world, he was a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. Just beyond the reinforced glass of the ICU doors, the atmosphere was far less solemn. His lieutenants, men who had once bowed so low their foreheads touched the floor, now stood tall, their eyes bright with the fever of opportunity. They were the vultures he had raised, and they were already sharpening their talons. The neurosurgeons were clear, hissed Kim Sang-woo, Joon-young's ambitious third-in-command, his voice cutting through the clinical silence. He adjusted his silk tie, his gaze flickering toward the DNR papers resting on a nurse's station, as if they were a deed to a gold mine. The brain activity is zero. Keeping the Iron Dragon on a leash of wires isn't loyalty. It's bad business. The Busan shipping lanes are already stalling because the port authorities smell blood in the water. Business, countered another, his voice low and dangerous. We are talking about the man who gave you those shoes, Sang-woo. We wait for the 48-hour mark, not a second sooner. We wait, and we lose everything, Sang-woo snapped back, leaning in close. The syndicate in Tokyo is already moving on the Jeju transit routes. If we don't sign those papers and name a successor tonight, there won't be an empire left to rule. We aren't mourning a boss. We are guarding a vacuum. They argued over his life as if it were a depreciating asset, their shadows stretching long and dark across the polished floor. To them, the man in the bed was a silent city where the lights had been extinguished forever. They calculated the value of his death in offshore accounts and territory maps, oblivious to the fact that the most dangerous thing in the world is a predator who has nothing left to lose but his silence. Inside the room, Joon-young's hand lay cold on the white sheets, the gold band on his finger the only thing still catching the sterile light, waiting for a touch that wasn't motivated by greed. Outside, the pens were already unsheathed, ready to sign away a life that had supposedly already left. The heavy double doors of the VIP wing didn't creak. They glided open with a silent, expensive precision that matched the cold hearts of the men standing guard. In the hallway, the air was thick with the scent of sterilized floor wax and the metallic tang of unspoken treason. Park Joon-young's inner circle, men in razor-sharp charcoal suits and silk ties, huddled like vultures over a fresh kill. They were busy carving up the Iron Dragon's territory, their voices low as they debated which shipping lanes to seize and which rivals to execute. They were so consumed by the math of their betrayal that they didn't notice the elevator chime. Then, the clicking of heels began. It was a steady, rhythmic sound that cut through the clinical hum of the ICU like a countdown. Park Jin-hwan, the second in command who already wore Joon-young's ring on his pinky, looked up, a sneer forming on his lips, until he saw her. Zandi Imani didn't walk like a woman who had been discarded 3 years ago. She moved through the corridor with a haunting grace, her presence a sudden, vibrant defiance against the monochrome gray of the hospital. Her face, framed by a halo of dark curls, was a mask of restrained agony. Her eyes, bloodshot and heavy with the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, were fixed solely on the door of room 6002. The guards stepped forward, their hands instinctively moving to the holsters hidden beneath their blazers. "This is a restricted zone," one growled, his voice trembling slightly. He recognized her from the old photographs, the only woman who had ever made the Iron Dragon hesitate. Zandi didn't stop. She didn't even look at him. "Move," she whispered. And though her voice was soft, it carried the authority of a queen returning to a fallen kingdom. The sheer audacity of her arrival acted like a physical barrier. The guards froze, paralyzed by the ghost of the loyalty they once held for the man dying behind those doors. Jin-hwan stepped into her path, his eyes narrowing. "You have no standing here, Zandi. He signed the papers. You're nothing to the syndicate now." Zandi finally turned her gaze toward him, and for a second, the traitor flinched. The raw, volcanic pain in her eyes was more terrifying than any blade. "I'm not here for your syndicate, Gain-hwan," she said, her voice cracking as a single hot tear finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "I'm here for my husband." She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his in a final gesture of contempt. As she reached the handle of the ICU door, she hesitated for only a heartbeat. She could feel the coldness of the metal, a mirror to the man she had been told was already gone. With a sharp intake of breath, she stepped into the sterile tomb, leaving the vultures in the hallway to choke on the silence of their own greed. The air in room 6002 was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the ghostly weight of things left unsaid. As Zandi's head rested against Joon-young's motionless chest, the rhythmic, hollow beep of the heart monitor began to blur, pulling her back into a memory saturated in color and heat. It was a time before the clinical white of this ICU, when the Iron Dragon was vibrant, dangerous, and entirely hers. She remembered the way the ink on his skin felt under her fingertips. A sprawling, intricate masterpiece of dragons and lotus flowers that felt like a living shield. Their marriage hadn't been built on the quiet stability of normal people. It was forged in the fire of high-stakes galas and the hushed, lethal whispers of the Seoul underground. Joon-young had been her protector, a man who moved through the world like a storm, yet always became a calm harbor when he walked through their front door. He used to trace the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the scars on his knuckles, promising her that as long as he breathed, the darkness of his world would never touch her. But the darkness was greedy. The memory shifted, turning cold and jagged. The day of the divorce wasn't marked by a fight, but by a silence that felt like a death sentence. Joon-young had stood in their sun-drenched living room, his face a mask of cold, impenetrable marble. He didn't look at her, he looked through her, his amber eyes drained of the warmth she had come to rely on. "Sign it," he had said, sliding the papers across the table with a detachment that made her blood run cold. He hadn't told her about the hit placed on his head, or the 3 rival syndicates closing in on his borders. He only told her she was a liability, a weakness he could no longer afford. He had intentionally broken her heart to save her life, pushing her away with a cruelty that was its own kind of mercy. He had stood like a statue as she packed her bags, never flinching, even when she begged him to tell her the truth. He had chosen to be a monster so she could remain a civilian. Now, as the memory faded and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital returned, Zandi tightened her grip on his gown. The man who had forced her into exile for her own good was now the one who was truly helpless. She leaned closer to his ear, her voice a jagged, serrated edge of grief and hope. "You thought you were protecting me by leaving me alone, Joon-young," she whispered, her breath hitching against the cold skin of his neck. "But you didn't just leave me with a broken heart. You left me with the only thing in this world that still belongs to both of us." The air in room 6002 didn't just feel cold, it felt terminal. Dr. Han, the hospital's leading neurosurgeon, stepped away from the glowing array of brain scans with a finality that echoed louder than the hum of the ventilators. He didn't look at Zandi, he looked at the digital readout where the Iron Dragon's consciousness was supposed to be. "There is nothing," he whispered, his voice stripped of professional hope. "The cortical silence is absolute. We've run the stimuli tests 3 times. Park Joon-young is no longer in that body. He is a house with the foundation stripped away." Outside the heavy plexiglass doors, the silence was replaced by the low, predatory murmurs of men in tailored silk. Joon-young's second-in-command, a man named Choi, who had once bowed so low his forehead touched the floor, was now standing tall, a gold-plated pen hovering over the legal DNR papers. To them, the doctor's words weren't a tragedy. They were a starting gun. They didn't see a fallen brother, they saw a massive, stagnant fortune waiting to be liquidated. 48 hours, Choi muttered to the gathered lieutenants, his eyes gleaming with a reflected clinical light. The board of directors won't wait any longer. By Thursday morning, the Iron Dragon becomes a myth, and we become the new kings of the Seoul docks. He turned to a subordinate who was discreetly holding a small, unmarked vial. It wasn't a standard sedative. It was the final injection, a cocktail designed to ensure that even if a miracle tried to claw its way into Joon-young's nervous system, it would find only chemical ash. They weren't just waiting for him to die, they were preparing to kill the ghost. Inside the room, Zandi felt the shift in the atmosphere. She could see the shadows of the men through the frosted glass, circling like sharks in shallow water. She looked down at Joon-young's hand, so still it looked carved from pale stone. The gold wedding band he still wore felt like a hot coal against her gaze. She knew the clock was no longer ticking. It was counting down. The doctors had retreated, the guards had been bribed to look away, and the men who once called him Master were now his executioners. She leaned closer, her tears hot and silent, falling onto the sterile white sheets. The monitors showed a flat, unyielding red line, a visual representation of a soul that had supposedly left the building. But as the shadows outside moved closer to the door, Zandi felt a desperate, primal surge of defiance. She didn't care what the scans said. She knew the man who had survived a dozen wars wouldn't leave her alone to face these monsters. She pressed her forehead against his, her breath hitching as she prepared to whisper the one truth that could either shatter the silence or destroy them both. The heavy, clinical scent of antiseptic and ozone hung thick in room 6002, a sterile tomb for a man who had once commanded the very air people breathed. Zandi Imani sat in the low-slung vinyl chair pulled tight against the bedside, her fingers trembling as they hovered just an inch above Joon-young's cold, ink-patterned hand. The machines were the only things speaking now, a rhythmic, hollow shriek of electricity that mocked the silence of the man who used to be a hurricane. "You always said the shadows would protect us, Joon-young," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry earth. "You told me that if you became the monster, the world would leave me alone. But look at us now. You're a ghost, and I'm just the woman mourning a man who chose a crown of thorns over a life with me." She leaned forward, her bloodshot eyes tracing the familiar sharp line of his jaw, now softened by the slackness of a mind that had gone dark. She remembered a different life, one that lived in the brief, stolen moments before the Iron Dragon had fully consumed him. She saw the ghost of a small apartment in Busan, the smell of rain on the pavement, and the way he used to look at her before he decided that loving her was a liability he couldn't afford. "We could have had that house by the sea," she choked out, a fresh tear tracking through the salt stain on her cheek and falling onto his motionless chest. "No bodyguards, no blood money, just you, me, and the sound of the waves. You pushed me away to save me, you idiot. You gave me a divorce and a bank account when all I ever wanted was your heartbeat next to mine." She reached out, finally closing the distance, her palm resting over his silent heart. Through the thin hospital gown and the tangle of ECG wires, he felt like a statue of marble, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly unreachable. The doctors had told her his brain was a silent city, that the Iron Dragon had finally met a foe he couldn't intimidate. But as she collapsed against him, her forehead resting on his shoulder, the weight of the secret she had carried across oceans finally broke her. "I didn't come here for your empire, Joon-young. I didn't come to watch you die," she sobbed into the stillness of his chest, her breath warm against his cool skin. "I came to tell you that you didn't win. You didn't protect me from everything. Because even after you broke us, I'm still here. And I'm not alone." She pulled his hand toward her, pressing his lifeless palm against her stomach, where a tiny hidden rhythm beat in defiance of the flat line on the screen. "He has your eyes, Joon-young, and he's the only truth I have left." The clinical hum of the ICU felt like a countdown, each rhythmic beep of the monitor a hammer blow against the coffin of the man she once called her own. Zandi Imani stood at the edge of the bed, her breath hitching in the sterile air. Park Joon-young, the Iron Dragon, who had once commanded entire cities with a single glance, was now reduced to a statue of pale skin and cooling ink. To the doctors, he was a medical impossibility. To his lieutenants, he was a throne to be looted. But to Zandi, looking at the gold wedding band still resting on his motionless hand, he was the only man who had ever truly seen her. The weight of the last 3 years, the cold divorce, the forced distance, and the terrifying silence of the last 3 weeks finally broke her. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed against the side of the high-security bed, her forehead resting against the rough fabric of his hospital gown. The scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the faint, lingering trace of the sandalwood cologne he had always worn. She sobbed, a raw, guttering sound that tore through the artificial quiet of the room, her tears soaking into the center of his chest, exactly where the 3 bullets had tried to steal his life. "You coward," she choked out, her voice a ragged whisper that barely carried to the sensors of the heart monitor. "You thought you could just push me away and leave me to handle the world alone? You thought you were protecting me by becoming a ghost?" She clutched the sheets, her fingers bruising against the metal rails. She felt the faint, hollow thud of his heart beneath her ear, a beat so weak it felt like a flickering candle in a hurricane. Zandi leaned closer, her lips brushing the skin just above his collarbone, where a dragon's tail coiled in dark blue ink. She didn't care if the hidden microphones picked it up. She didn't care if the vultures in the hallway heard. "You don't get to quit, Joon-young. Not today." Her voice dropped to a low, desperate vibration that seemed to hum against his very bones. "Because there is something I never told you. Something I was too afraid to say the day you walked out." She took a shuddering breath, her hand sliding down to rest over her own stomach, then back to his cold palm. "I'm not alone, Joon-young. I'm carrying the life you said we could never have. I'm pregnant. Our son is waiting for his father to wake up." She pressed her face harder against his chest, her heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, primal rhythm. "The Iron Dragon doesn't leave his heir behind. Please, come back to us." For a moment, the only sound was the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator. And then, deep within the silence of Joon-young's brain, a single, violent spark of electricity roared to life. The silence of room 6002 was not merely the absence of sound. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a tomb waiting to be sealed. For 21 days, Park Joon-young's consciousness had been a vast, frozen wasteland, a silent city where the power grid had been cut and the streets were buried under miles of black ice. Outside the door, the world was moving on. His empire was being dismantled by men who wore his loyalty like a discarded cloak. But inside, the only thing that remained of the Iron Dragon was the rhythmic, hollow hiss of a ventilator and the green line on the monitor that stayed stubbornly, mockingly flat. Zandi's collapse was not a graceful descent. It was the breaking of a woman who had carried the weight of a secret too heavy for the living, let alone the dead. As her forehead pressed against the cold cotton of his hospital gown, right over the spot where his heart had once thundered with the fury of a warlord, her tears soaked into the fabric. They were hot, a searing contrast to his clammy gray skin. "Joon-young," she choked out, her voice a fractured rasp that barely rose above the hum of the machines. "You don't get to leave. You don't get to hide in the dark while I carry this alone." She gripped the railing of the bed, her knuckles white, her body trembling with a primal, desperate grief. She leaned closer, her lips brushing the shell of his ear, whispering the truth that was meant to be his final judgment. "I'm pregnant, you fool. You have a son, and if you leave us now, the monsters you created will ensure he never sees the light of day. Wake up, Please, wake up." For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then, deep within the frozen machinery of Joon-young's brain, a spark caught. It wasn't a gradual warming, it was a lightning strike in a dead forest. The name Zandi acted like a master key, turning a lock that had been rusted shut by trauma and blood. The darkness didn't just recede, it shattered. The heart monitor, which had maintained a steady, deathly drone for weeks, suddenly gave a jagged, high-pitched shriek. The flat green line spasmed, leaping into a frantic, erratic mountain range of crimson peaks. In the nursing station, alarms began to howl, but inside the room, the only sound that mattered was the sudden, ragged intake of breath from the man on the bed. Joon-young's chest heaved upward, straining against the wires as if he were breaking through the surface of a deep, dark ocean. His fingers, long thought paralyzed, twitched and then curled, digging into the bedsheets with a strength that shouldn't have existed. The Iron Dragon wasn't just returning, he was clawing his way back from the void, fueled by the terrifying realization that his bloodline was no longer a legacy of death, but a promise of life. The high-pitched hum of the life support machines was the only thing keeping the silence of room 6002 from becoming absolute. Outside the heavy soundproofed doors, the muffled voices of men in silk suits rose in a fever of greed. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the salt of Zandi's tears. She remained collapsed against Joon-young's chest, her small, trembling hand clutching the hospital gown where the ink of a dragon's tail peeked through the fabric. Her whisper hung in the air like a prayer, a confession of the life growing inside her, the secret heir to a throne currently being dismantled by vultures. As the clock on the wall ticked toward the final hour of the DNR mandate, the door hissed open. Park Jin-hwan stepped inside, the fluorescent lights glinting off his gold watch. A watch Joon-young had given him for a decade of supposed loyalty. He didn't look at the woman sobbing on the bed. To him, she was an obstacle, a ghost from a past that was being erased. He walked toward the primary console, his shadow falling over the Iron Dragon's pale, bearded face. "It's time, boss," Jin-hwan murmured, his voice devoid of the reverence he had performed for years. "The Empire needs a king who can breathe on his own." His hand reached out, fingers hovering inches away from the master switch that would silence the ventilator and let the darkness finally claim the room. Zandi didn't move. She was spent, her forehead pressed against Joon-young's cold skin, waiting for the end. But as Jin-hwan's fingertip grazed the cold plastic of the kill switch, the room's energy shifted with a violent electric snap. A hand, calloused and mapped with scars, shot out from the sheets with the speed of a striking cobra. Before Jin-hwan could even gasp, 5 fingers clamped around his wrist with a strength that shouldn't belong to the living, let alone the brain-dead. The sound of bone groaning under the pressure echoed in the small room. Jin-hwan's eyes bulged, his gaze dropping to the bed in sheer, paralyzing terror. Park Joon-young's eyes were no longer vacant pools staring at the ceiling. They were wide, focused, and burning with a terrifying, predatory clarity. The amber depth in his pupils flared with the Iron Dragon's signature cold fury. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The raw, crushing power in his grip told the story of a man who had heard every word of the betrayal and every syllable of the whispered truth. Zandi gasped, lifting her head to see the miracle unfolding beneath her. The flat line on the monitor didn't just spike, it roared into a rhythmic, violent pulse. The Predator had not just returned, he had been summoned back by the only voice he was ever meant to follow, and the man holding the switch was the first debt he intended to collect. The monitor's rhythmic chirping was no longer a countdown to death. It was a war drum. Park Joon-young sat propped against the sterile pillows, his body a map of healing scars and fading ink. But his eyes were the sharpest they had been in a decade. Zandi slept fitfully in the vinyl chair beside him, her hand still resting near his, her breathing finally heavy with the exhaustion of a woman who had carried the world alone for too long. He looked at her, then at the slight curve of her stomach, and a cold, protective fire ignited in his chest. The Iron Dragon was no longer interested in a crown of blood, but he would use every remaining drop of his influence to burn the path clear for the woman who had called him back from the void. With a trembling hand, he reached for the encrypted smartphone hidden in the secret compartment of his bedside locker, a device the doctors assumed was a relic of a dead man. It hummed to life, the blue light reflecting in his amber eyes like a digital predator. His first move was silent and absolute. He bypassed 3 layers of international banking security, entering the dark web portal of his private holdings. With a few swift keystrokes, he located the predatory loans that had been suffocating Zandi. He didn't just pay them. He erased the entire firm from the digital ledger, flagging their offshore accounts for international oversight until the company simply ceased to exist. Next, he redirected a blind trust, one originally intended for black market arms, into a private, untraceable account in Zandi's name. In a single heartbeat, he had transformed her from a woman drowning in debt into one of the wealthiest private citizens in the country. But the cleansing had only just begun. Joon-young's gaze shifted to the encrypted messaging app, where his lieutenants were still arguing over the distribution of his ports. He watched their greed play out in real time, a sickening display of disloyalty. His thumbs moved with lethal precision. He didn't send an assassin, he sent information. To the National Tax Service, he leaked the hidden ledgers of the men who had signed his DNR. To the rival syndicates, he sent the GPS coordinates of their private warehouses, framed as a gift from a dying boss. He watched as the icons representing his enemy's power began to blink and vanish. By the time the sun began to bleed through the hospital blinds, the vultures in the hallway weren't waiting for a death certificate. They were receiving frantic calls about frozen accounts and police raids. Joon-young leaned back, his breath hitching as his body reminded him of its frailty, but he didn't stop. He had spent a lifetime taking. Now, he was dismantling the very throne he had bled for, brick by digital brick. He wasn't just killing his enemies, he was murdering the Iron Dragon so that a father could finally take his place. The heavy, iron-scented air of the Seoul underground had been replaced by the fragrance of sea salt and blooming jasmine. 6 months had passed since the night the machines in room 6002 were silenced, not by death, but by a miracle whispered into the skin of a dying man. On the sun-drenched balcony of a villa overlooking the Jeju coastline, Park Joon-young sat in a simple linen shirt, his once feared Iron Dragon tattoos now mostly hidden beneath his sleeves, a fading map of a life he no longer recognized. He watched the horizon, where the gold of the afternoon sun kissed the turquoise water, feeling a peace that no amount of territory or blood money had ever been able to buy. Inside the glass-walled living room, the rhythmic sound of a rocking chair provided the heartbeat of his new world. Zandi sat there, the light catching the vibrant patterns of her wrap, her face no longer etched with the hollow exhaustion of the ICU. In her arms lay the truth she had once whispered into the dark, a small, sleeping boy with his father's stubborn brow and his mother's serene spirit. Joon-young rose, his movements steady and deliberate, devoid of the predatory tension that had defined him for 40 years. He stepped inside, the cool marble floor a stark contrast to the grimy back alleys of his past. He stood behind Zandi, resting a hand, the same hand that had once clamped onto a traitor's throat, gently on her shoulder. She leaned her head back against his hip, looking up with eyes that were clear and full of a quiet, hard-won joy. There were no more guards at the door, no more vultures circling the perimeter. The syndicate had been dismantled, its assets liquidated into clinics and foundations for the invisible souls Joon-young had once stepped over. He had traded a crown of thorns for a life in the light, realizing that his greatest strength wasn't the empire he had built, but the family he had nearly lost. As the baby stirred, reaching out a tiny, instinctive hand to grasp Joon-young's thumb, the former boss felt a surge of emotion more powerful than any adrenaline. He had been pronounced brain dead by the world's finest doctors. But in this moment, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest, he knew he had never been more alive. The Iron Dragon was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood that the most important territory he would ever hold was right here, within these four walls. The silence was no longer clinical or oppressive. It was the peaceful, breathing silence of a sanctuary built on the truth. Joon-young pressed a kiss to Zandi's forehead, a silent vow that the shadows would never touch them again. They were no longer living in the cracks of the city. They were the authors of a new history, written in the golden light of a second chance. Park Joon-young spent a lifetime building a crown of iron, only to realize it was the whispered truth of a woman he loved that gave him a reason to breathe again. His story teaches us that we are never truly lost as long as someone is willing to call us back to the light. If this story moved you, please subscribe and turn on post notifications to join our community. Like, share, and comment Miracle. Tell us where in the world you are watching from below to let us know you made it to the end.